To me, a stakeholder needs to understand the status of the project within 15 to 20 seconds of reading a status report.
I feel like you're really calling me out here, Yara, on that one. I'm going to take away with a few of these tidbits for myself.
This podcast is for informational/entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional advice. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts/guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Rockridge or its affiliates.
Welcome to the Automation Journey podcast. I'm your host, Colin Hutchings. A successful automation implementation is a lot like an omelet. There are multiple ingredients that must blend together to produce something greater than the sum of its parts. It also requires breaking a few eggs. So far, we've heard from both solution providers and end users who have adopted mobile automation into their own operations. Today, we find ourselves in the middle, talking to one of the unsung heroes of any implementation, the project manager. A project manager's job description is right there on the box. They manage projects. Easy enough to say, but that is where the simplicity ends. Project management requires coordinating with vendors as well as the customer's team and taking many pieces not designed to inherently work together to create a holistic system that does. All of those elements must be scheduled, managed, and controlled by the project manager. Our guest today began her career on the floor of some of North America's largest distribution facilities as a lead controls engineer. Now, she is the person tasked with delivering and sustaining complex automation implementations. Yara Alsuwailem is the head of engineering and implementation at EQ Solutions, and she joins me today to discuss what good project management in our industry looks like and what happens when expectations go unmet. Yara, welcome to the Automation Journey.
Hey, Colin. Thanks for having me.
So you began your career as a controls engineer involved in integrated solution deployment in some of the largest facilities throughout North America. You've since moved on to running project management, and also now you're the head of implementation and engineering at EQ Solutions. At what point did you realize that getting the technical details right is really just one piece of the puzzle, and that actually a successful automation project requires a lot more to it?
For me, that realization happened when I was commissioning a multi-million square foot facility, like you said. You can write the cleanest PLC code. However, if there are unresolved mechanical catch points or the customer's operation team hasn't been trained on error handling and correct system recovery, the automation will sit idle. Automation doesn't just exist in a vacuum. The technical deployment is just the baseline, but the real differentiator between a successful go-live and costly changes afterwards is really rigorous project management and ensuring customer readiness post-go-live.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about the project management, because on the integrator side, in your experience, in your past life running projects, you would also have a counterpart on the end user side who's responsible for the project management. And the approach for the two sides it's a bit different, right? All working towards the same end goal, but from different angles. In your experience, where have you seen gaps in the way that the two approach, and maybe are things sometimes left kind of unattended?
Yeah, so integrators often approach projects from the perspective of their scope on paper. So they might have their own checklist, they have their categories, for example, mechanical install, electrical install, field wiring, and then commissioning afterwards. While customers are often more concerned with business level KPIs, they're looking at operational throughput overall, they're looking at ROI, they're also looking at slotting accuracy. And so you can see that those objectives can be different. And so when an integrator or an integrator's project manager hands over a subsystem, because technically their checklist is complete, right? They've done the mechanical, they've done the electrical, the system's commissioned, the conveyor just runs. The customer might still feel like the project is incomplete from their perspective because they can't ship product out the door, right? And so to bridge that gap we have to align very early on with the customer on what success actually look like. And we have to work together towards the operational capabilities of the system and not just the technical checklist.
So underscoring the importance of really just aligning at the outset, the beginning of the project, understanding what does success look like to the customer, and trying to help empower them through your own project management to make their project management successful. How about on the day-to-day, kind of tactically, how an integrator may approach project management versus the end user side? Or do you notice that there are any gaps there?
On the integrator side, we always stress also the importance of having a dedicated customer implementation team that the integrator can have a weekly cadence with. Because the customer just assumes, I've invested in automation and I'm just expecting it to work. However, there are interdisciplinary departments on the customer side that have to work together to make the automation work. So for example, building power usually isn't something that the integrator is responsible for. That's a customer responsibility. However, if there's no implementation team on the customer side that is holding their own like in-house electricians accountable, then that task could be missed, right? Which then has a cascading effect on the overall schedule.
What are some of the most common gaps in project readiness that you see from customers who are taking their first foray into automation? Because the first project is always the most challenging, right?
Customers often underestimate the need for IT and WMS engagement early. So when we're designing the system, they'll sit with us, we'll go through the design meetings, we'll talk about how to design for inventory receiving, storing, and then shipping later on. And all these conversations take place and they're great, and we get great customer engagement. However, we're having these conversations sometimes without IT or WMS engagement. And so when we finally get introduced to the WMS team or the IT team, and we outlay this plan, we're often met with the fact that their WMS teams, for instance, are currently at capacity, right? And so they need more development time, which often causes project delays because we can't just plug and play an ASRS system without having that system, for lack of a better word, talk to the customer's WMS. So I say typically early on in projects, we really stress and explain to the customer the importance of their IT team and WMS's team's engagement, which is often a very missed point in these projects. And customers hesitate to involve these teams early on because maybe they're afraid of complications or they think that they can get by without them early. But the sooner we speak with these individuals, the better plan we have moving forward, better the plan is for them as well moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've seen sometimes there'd be a hesitancy for a counterpart on the end user side, on the customer side, to not want to bring in other folks, perhaps early on, right? Perhaps because they don't want to overcomplicate or be a burden. But really, some of these stakeholders are so critical. And so you mentioned that you tackle that early in the project phase, but what are your thoughts on the importance of stressing or the customer evaluating these types of IT topics even prior to that in the sales phase?
If we make assumptions that turn out to not be true later on, then those are costly change orders. And our objective is always to minimize cost and get the schedule as accurate as possible, right? As project managers, that's our responsibility. And so the earlier we can engage with these teams, we can ensure that we're capturing all these details, that our assumptions are in fact correct prior to planning and post-sale.
Stay tuned for more of the automation journey after this word about Rockridge. Is your company experiencing an impact on productivity due to labor challenges? Rockridge has partnered with companies in numerous industries, and we've helped them address their challenges. Many of our customers have seen measurable improvements in as little as 30 days from go live. This provides the freedom to assign human operators to the tasks humans do best and leaves the robot work for robots. Find links to contact us in the description or email info@rockridge.com today. Rockridge is your mobile automation team in North America.
What goes into project planning and scheduling for a large-scale integrated solution? And what are some items that, if you don't get right early on, can really have a negative effect on timeline?
Yeah, so project planning requires a highly sequential critical path schedule where software, mechanical, and electrical timelines are completely synchronized. The elements that I've seen most likely to cause delays is also facility readiness. For example, when putting in an ASRS system or any robotic system that utilizes AMRs, the building floor has to be pretty flat with a very small margin of tolerance. And this is typically something that integrators will communicate, in writing, like they'll have it in a proposal. Maybe it's 100-page proposal and that's just 1-page requirement. And naturally, the customer misses that and doesn't realize that that's a responsibility that they may have, right? And so they don't catch it. The integrator's project manager might not put that in their timeline because, technically it's not the integrator's scope, but it is a prerequisite. And so the integrator might come to site to start install and realize that the floor is not flat enough and it hasn't been remediated. And so that pushes the installation schedule out, which pushes commissioning testing and therefore go live.
So really underscoring the importance for customers to understand what obligations might rest on their side, and not from the vendor, not from the integrator themselves. Could be involved in orchestrating the majority of the project, but there are certain elements that are going to fall on the facility side, and just really not to lose track on them and not put all of your confidence 100% in the project planning on the integrator, as they don't possess 100% of the scope.
Absolutely.
Little details like that could easily go missed, for sure.
Yeah. It might look like, one bullet point under customer responsibilities in a proposal, but then that could cascade into a 3-week lead time that pushes the schedule out.
Yeah, and for our listeners, generally speaking, that it's not as if you're looking to hide anything, right, as the integrator in your proposal. It's just that, it's a page. You can fit everything on a page, and it would be a bit redundant to have that page 10 times, right? You have it there effectively communicated once. But just for the listeners out there, if you do receive a long form proposal like that from an integrator, make sure you go through it page by page with the person who issued that proposal to you, so that everything is really, the importance of every topic is underscored the way it should be. And also, if your companies permit doing so, leveraging AI as a tool, as a resource to help you understand where the critical elements of a proposal might be, can also be useful. Because that one page can be tricky, but most people are not trying to hide anything from you.
Absolutely. Yeah. From the integrator's perspective, they can think of it as, I've communicated it to the customer, it's customer scope, right? But for new customers that haven't done this before, they might not understand the impact that things like facility readiness and floor flatness can have on a timeline.
So what do you find to be the most commonly avoidable reasons for scheduling delays, and what are things that an integrator or the customer can do to help prevent those delays from occurring?
Some delays, which are maybe harder to spot, as you're managing a project is oftentimes it's scope creep disguised as minor tweaks, right? So for instance, when installing a section of conveyor bed based on installation drawing, the customer might walk in and see the conveyor in real life installed for the first time, and sometimes they change their mind and ask to move it a few feet. Of course, a one-off scenario might be okay. However, repeated instances of these requests can eventually delay the install. Another example would be minor changes like asking for different features or buttons on the user interface. These requests typically feel minor at first, but they do take up a good amount of software development time. And so to prevent these scenarios from delaying projects, strict change management is crucial. Also, having the customer sign off on items like installation drawings before we even get to site, having them sign off on software scope, and being aligned prior to execution and not during execution.
You've overseen automation projects and large integrated systems that involve at times subcontractor scope too that you manage. How does a complex system like that compare to a system where there may just be one supplier element going in, just a single system component? What are the differences between the two? Both are projects, right? But what are the differences between the two, and how is the scope and the magnitude of the larger integrated system? How does that complicate things and maybe make some challenges that are unique?
Yeah, those projects tend to be more complex, whether they're larger or smaller, because they require managing multiple points of failure. And so that also means having even more people to coordinate with and constantly communicate with. So my personal approach is setting up workshop meetings very early on with all the sub-vendors where we map out every detail and scope and assign ownership to the appropriate parties.
You mentioned with the integrated systems, they have more multiple points of failure. Where do you typically see the failures occurring most prevalently?
Yeah, typically they occur when like a handover is required from one system to the next, or when two physical parts of the system are installed by two different vendors, right? And so maybe the conveyor elevations don't match up, or the AMR's elevation doesn't match up to the conveyor P&D stand on the other side. So, simple but critical aspects to the system like that when it comes to the intersection between two different systems are usually where we see the most issues, or the most issues where vendors could argue that it's not their scope, or that they've installed for their layout.
How do you ensure that accountability is directed where it needs to be and that those issues are resolved?
What's important is I remain objective and I rely strictly on data and an objective project log to avoid any finger pointing. So when a fault occurs at the intersection point, for example, we look closer at the messaging. Like, did the WCS send the correct and expected message to the WMS? And then did the WMS acknowledge and send the correct response back to the WCS, right? It's important to capture everything in a data log, which acts as a single point of truth or single source of truth, and to use that when going back to these vendors is, look, here's the objective data, here's where the messaging failed. The messaging has to be rewritten to match what we've already discussed during the planning sessions months prior.
I'd like to switch gears just a little bit here. Our listeners, we'd like to provide them info on how they could best approach vendor selection. What are some items that customer should discuss with a prospective integrator? In fact, obligations that they should see in their sales agreement for a given system, and so that to ensure to get the confidence that they're going to be cared for and that they have the right backing in the project agreement to ensure that they're not taking undue risk.
So I would say customers, especially customers who are new to automation, need to clearly define who the master system integrator is and establish a clear master work agreement with them, or some kind of contractual obligation, right? If a customer goes out and purchases 3 different subsystems from 3 different providers, they're essentially taking on all the risk and liability for the overall project. And so most leaders on the customer side wish that they had contracted a single point of accountability for end-to-end system performance. That way they ensure full warehouse operations and not just the handover of subsystems independently that might not integrate well together. So yeah, I would highly stress a master system integrator identified and an established master work agreement.
Continuing in the vein of fine print, everyone's favorite topic, safety standards, norms and safety standards. One example being for automated guided vehicles here in the United States, ANSI B56.5. There are guidelines in this agreement for what the responsibility of a manufacturer is, what the responsibility of, indeed, the end user running the system is. In your experience, how well do customers and integrators and customers understand really their obligations as defined in these safety agreements, and where could they where are some areas they could touch up their understanding before they deploy their next project?
When it comes to safety standards, we've seen gaps occur both on the manufacturer OEM side and also on the customer's operations side. Sometimes due to the manufacturer provider being overseas and not fully capturing all safety engineering accurately that's done stateside. So we're often pretty open with our providers in informing them that we do follow, OSHA regulations and safety regulations stateside, and, ensuring that they understand that early on. Also, an important factor for customers to look for is whether these providers have any installations that are proven here in the United States, right? We've gotten videos from customers or requests where they've gone overseas and they see this really cool system and they show it to us and they say, hey, can you install something like this? And it turns out, looking at the system, it's full like robotic ASRS, but there's no safety fencing whatsoever around the robotic field. And that would absolutely fail under OSHA regulations here stateside.
In my experience, and certainly in mobile automation, the safety fields that are required to constantly be working at a high performance level, typically performance level D, in order to meet the demands of the safety standards, requires more space than manual operations. Do you find that there's also, just in the very early planning stages, that there are sometimes a gap in understanding from the customer what is even possible, what is even feasible when deploying automation?
Yeah, for sure. And we've gotten, for instance, requests from customers when going through planning and layout design where they wanted a system that is both automated and manual, And so they wanted us to obviously move, for instance, their pallets using our shuttle system, or our robotics. But they also wanted the capability to go in and pull these pallets out manually. And we had to go through a process with them, and a full scale safety assessment to explain that that's not possible, and that we would have to, for instance, design conveyance that pulls these pallets out of the robotic system in order for a manual forklift to pick it up, right? And so naturally, that introduces more footprint to the system, that customers often overlook, right? They think they have more clearance than what's required from a safety perspective. And for robotics, typically, we have to go through a full safety assessment to understand our clearances, and where humans could operate and pick up from, and where we need to provide space for the robotic response time, essentially.
We'll return to the Automation Journey podcast in just a moment. If you want to explore any of the topics discussed in this episode more deeply, or any other material handling matter, please do not hesitate to contact Rockrich directly. Our experts will assist you in achieving your specific goals with mobile robots. Rockrich is ready to meet you wherever you are in your automation journey. Call 844-ROCKRICH, 844-762-7424, or email info@rockrich.com today. Rockrich is your mobile automation team in North America.
What are some reasons why, say, in the first 90 days, the system may not be meeting the customer's performance expectations, and what can you typically do as an integrator to help guide them get things back on track?
Yeah, and you're right. Often the first 90 days are the hardest on the customer post go live. And often the shortfall isn't necessarily the hardware. It's actually the operational processes that might not be well vetted or well captured. For instance, when running a conveyor system, they could have a misaligned photo eye or sensor. That sensor in that zone will cause a jam. The jam may stay active for hours before an operator or maintenance person on the customer side clears it, right? Typically, because the system is so new to the customer, it can be very intimidating to their operators and their maintenance personnel if they've never worked with automation before, right? Nobody wants to touch the big expensive machine because they don't want to break it. And these faults that we see, usually they take less than 1 minute to clear, but they stay active often for over an hour until someone calls a hotline and we walk them through clearing it. Well, these stakeholders, I usually ground the conversation and explain the big picture behind what's going on. For instance, I would use the misaligned sensor as an example, but I would explain that could happen, with a depressed e-stop if no one resets it either, and list other very recoverable instances. And so I'll typically stress operator and maintenance personnel training early and as often as possible, because the majority of these issues will look bad on a KPI side if they're not recovered instantly, but they're not major issues, and they're things that you could live with so long as the team is trained on recovering them.
You mentioned training, absolutely, yeah, so critical. And I liked how you said no one wants to touch the big scary machine, because I'm thinking about myself in that environment. I probably wouldn't want to either, right?
Yep.
It's a bit intimidating. So training being so important. What is your approach to training, and is that something that's evolved over time, just based on customer experiences and getting the feedback from them on how things are going in that first 90 days?
Often integrators and OEMs approach training as maybe a 2 or 3 day session where day number one is classroom and then day number two is on the floor, right? And they get the training sign off, and maybe everyone's happy for a day or two. But I think training early while the integrator is still commissioning the site is crucial, because during commissioning is where we spot most of the odd cases, and the points of failure, right? And if we have someone from the customer's maintenance team watching the team commission and watching all the recoverable incidents, then they'll feel more confident come day one of go live. But if all they've been through is only 2 days of training, classroom session and on-site session, then they're not going to feel as confident day one of go live, and they'll be very, very reliant on the integrators or the engineers to resolve the issues for them.
So yeah, a couple of things there. It's important that listeners here, partner with an integrator that actually does have such a comprehensive view of the importance of training and is willing to invest time in the process and not just make it about one day in the classroom, one day out on the floor, check the box and, have a party. So that's great. That's great input, as well as just understanding that if you do that, that is labor that the customer does need to, they do need to provide ahead, right? Someone from their maintenance team to learn. They need to plan for that, right? But that investment early on should pay dividends later, as if you do not invest early, you'll have more of the issues and it'll just, be more costly down the road. That was a good segue into my next question. Curious what customer expectations for after go live support look like, and how you guys would actually approach that to service their needs in terms of after go live support, and what are some critical things that details rather that customers should get right in their service agreements to ensure that they're selecting the right partner that will support them not only in the project deployment but the full life cycle of the integrated system.
Customers often will rely on a hotline, right? Which is very important. It's important that when you're down, you have someone to call and they'll try to help you resolve an issue. But I think post-go live support needs to be a proactive partnership and not just a reactive help desk, right? So support contracts should be vetted and included early, long before go live. I typically try to start that conversation before we even get to site, because support contracts tend to take a while to execute. And for customers, really, you want to avoid going back and forth and, maybe redlining the contract when you're about to go live in under a week. I would also stress the importance of having on-site support the first 2 weeks of go live, because those are the most crucial 2 weeks. The system's typically new. People might be trained, but they still might be hesitant, and so it's critical to make that investment in on-site go live support rather than ask for it later and then maybe the right resources are scheduled elsewhere at the time of go live. So that's a critical item that customers should ask about early and as soon as they can, is at least a few weeks of on-site go live support.
Many automation projects have in the facilities, there's typically a lot of manual operations buzzing about, right? You could have an upstream process, a downstream process that's manual, or even just a process running parallel, or just in the same area, the same operating area as the automation. What is your approach to, and how important is it for the customer to understand what a strategy might be to train and orient their manual operations staff early on in the project phase, so that there isn't a surprise later on, as they're now expected. Okay, we have go live. Now they're expected to keep working the same job that they've been accustomed to for years. Oh, now there's just a robot here and an ASRS over there.
Yeah, so again, goes back to training, but different than maintenance training is operations training, right? And operation or manual processes differ than working with automation. Working with automation, typically we have the happy path. I picked the order just like the screen told me to. I put it away just like the screen told me to. Maybe I pushed the box forward. But oftentimes, what tends to happen is the not so happy path. So what happens when I'm being asked to pick 4 items, but I only have 3 in the bin? And how do I sort an order, right? And these specific scenarios require specific SOPs that are specific to that customer and that site, right? They may not fully exist in the manual that you're being provided by the integrator. They're site-specific SOPs, and typically during testing and commissioning, the engineering teams and the customer team might encounter those scenarios, and they might, write some kind of process for them. But if that process is not captured on the customer side, on a training deck that operators are having to go through, then it could get lost, right? And so when these operators are working with the automation, they might run into these scenarios and they have to call a supervisor for assistance, for something that they could have resolved by following proper SOPs. They could also follow incorrect SOPs, right? And those will then have a cascading effect on the rest of the system and cause the inventory, for example, to be mismatched from the WMS to the WCS, the actual physical system. Capturing those SOPs in making sure they're documented, making sure they're included in training before operators switch from manual operations to operating with automation is crucial.
Great insights there. Yeah, thank you. Some of our listeners here today may be midway through their own automation project deployment, integrated systems deployment, and chances are there may be a bump or two in the road, hopefully mild, but perhaps some of them are in the middle of resolving a challenge that could affect timeline, which we never really want, right? So what are some things that they could do to help with managing the impact to timeline?
I would say communicating early and clearly and ensuring the appropriate personnel are identified early, right? So if there are issues with the inventory, for instance, ensuring that they know who to go to and who to assign that task to. So making sure that they have really good control of all personnel involved in a project, and ensuring that they're communicating with the appropriate party at the appropriate time, and thus minimizing the effects of maybe last minute requests or friction in a project.
Great. Final question for you, Yara. And you've given so much great input and advice through the entirety of this discussion. But my final question is if you could just give one piece of advice to someone about managing their first complex automation project, what would that be?
Yes. So I would say be purposeful when communicating with others. Don't assume that people understand your objectives because you outlined them on paper or because they exist in your project plan. Um, Over communicating is often better than under communicating. Sending status reports is important. However, be very concise and clear and really understand your audience. So, especially when the mailing list includes executive leaders, these are individuals that might be receiving hundreds of emails a day. And so, it's important to be clear with the status in your ask. If, for instance, you send a wall of text, they might just gloss over it and miss critical details that are lost in a long paragraph. Um, like if you need a leader to sign off on a layout or a change order with a deadline, title the email action required and make sure to include that request in the first paragraph of the text with what the missed deadline would be, right? And I see this with project managers early on is they want to ensure they're capturing all the detail that they could, right? Because they're trying to be great, they're trying to communicate, they're trying to over communicate. But if we're communicating, let's say 5 pages of just text, activities that happened in the week, and hidden in there is, action required, then people might miss those details, those crucial details that stakeholders need to be aware of. To me, a stakeholder needs to understand the status of the project within 15 to 20 seconds of reading a status report.
I feel like you're really calling me out here, Yara, on that one. I'm going to take away with a few of these tidbits for myself. Really appreciated so many good insights throughout this discussion. Once again, Yara, thank you so much for coming on the automation journey, and have a great day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Colin.
Any automation implementation has a lot of moving pieces, and I don't just mean the robots. The more planning that happens in the early stages of the project, the better. A project that comes online fortified with months of discussions, good communications, and stakeholder consensus will typically generate return on investment more quickly and add value to the operation for years to come. That's where world-class project managers come in. Yara provided a clear view to what great project management looks like. It smooths the rough patches and fills the gaps, giving the project a strong foundation and the best chance for success. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing this conversation, please share this video. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe to our channel. For Rockrich, I'm Colin, and thank you for watching.